Howdy y'all, happy Pride Month. Since I last covered transgender issues on the channel a year and a half ago, we have seen yet another significant push against trans rights in the political mainstream, with the UK Supreme Court recently ruling that the definition of a woman is based on an idealized view of biological sex, which doesn't even factor for biological sex not following the strict binary they cling to, much less the more significant cultural context from which we actually derive our ideas of womanhood in practice. And here in the US, the Trump administration is currently pushing the Big Beautiful Bill, which could see hundreds of thousands of trans people stripped of access to their life-saving medication. Transphobia has increasingly been wielded by the right as a political tool. It feels like we've been saying this for a decade now, but it's true. One concerning factor is that this general anti-trans sentiment appears to be growing more popular among the general population. A February 2025 Pew Research poll, following up on a similar poll from 2022, found universal upticks in support for anti-trans legislation, with support for policies such as sports bans, gender-affirming care bans for minors, and bathroom bills seeing jumps of 8 to 10% among the general population, compared to the prior survey. Meanwhile, support for anti-discrimination laws and insurance coverage for gender-affirming care fell by similar margins. It's not just that in an increasingly desperate attempt to curry favor, politicians are leaning more heavily on transphobic policy, but rather that the public itself is growing increasingly radicalized against trans people. I know people personally who have grown increasingly transphobic over the years. It's disheartening. So today, I'd like to take a look at how we got here and speculate on what the future holds. To start, let's examine a curious phenomenon. You see, one of the major aspects of the anti-trans movement is how much it has been pushed along by prominent actors. Notable transphobes like J.K. Rowling, Kelly J. Keane, Matt Walsh, Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, Ben Shapiro, Chloe Cole, and others have achieved lots of recognition in the public eye and contributed to a media landscape that fosters a growing transphobia. Comparatively, where are the trans people? This isn't just to say where are the trans people in general. I'm pretty sure most of them are in Portland. Rather, there's a comparative lack of prominent pro-trans activists, where outspoken transphobes dominate the White House, the media, and the lecture circuit. Pro-trans activism is largely relegated to independent media, grassroots protest, and community mutual aid. This is all good stuff, obviously, but it just doesn't occupy the same place in the public consciousness as the more prominent transphobia. This rift in prominence isn't the result of simple differences in approach. Rather, there's a startling difference in the level of institutional support available to anti- and pro-trans activists. And fortunately, for purposes of example and nothing else, there's an anti- and pro-trans activist whose paths are intertwined and can help demonstrate this. Part 1. The Worst Loser. On March 18, 2022, at the NCAA Women's Swimming Championships, cisgender Kentucky swimmer Riley Gaines and transgender Penn swimmer Leah Thomas tied for 5th place in the 200-yard freestyle. These championships would be the last event of each woman's swimming career, but just the beginning of their activist careers, as both women would find themselves launched into the national spotlight, on opposite ends of one of the most contentious debates in America today, the participation of trans women athletes in women's sports. Leah Thomas began her time at Penn swimming for the men's team, but would transition in 2019, undergoing hormone replacement therapy and coming out to her team and coaches. She would continue to play on the men's team for the 2019-2020 season, and following a year off due to the coronavirus pandemic, would begin to play on the women's team, having met the NCAA's eligibility criteria. During the 2021-2022 season, Thomas would see the best results of her career. While her times did not approach the best she was putting up prior to HRT, she still found herself winning meets. This would eventually culminate in her taking home the 500-yard title at the 2022 NCAA Championships, making her the first trans athlete to ever win an NCAA championship. These positive results would lead Thomas to become embroiled in controversy. Trans women athletes have long been cast as cheating men who switched to the women's teams to dominate supposedly inferior women. This idea has been popular for decades, showing up in popular media like The Simpsons, and tying in with many other narratives about trans women as deceivers, using their gender identity to gain something. This narrative is largely divorced from material reality, as culturally, women's sports are not really valued enough to justify any trans trickery, and trans women are practically insignificant in terms of their presence in and success at women's sports. Remember, Thomas is the only trans person to win an NCAA championship, and as far as I can tell, one of the only trans athletes to win anything at all. Nonetheless, she would be dogged by attack articles from conservative press, as well as accusations of unfairness from those on her own team, with 16 anonymous Penn swimmers writing a letter to the school, lambasting Thomas's unfair advantage, and popularizing a claim that would surround coverage of Thomas going forward, that she had been ranked number 462 in men's swimming, and had jumped to number 1 as a woman. This claim is really annoying to me, because for the life of me, I cannot find where the 462 number comes from. I won't pretend that I'm particularly knowledgeable about how swimming rankings are calculated, and I suppose this could be a real ranking. But for all the thousands of posts and articles that parrot it, nobody ever links to the actual source. What I can say is that Thomas did have significant results prior to transition. According to the database from usaswimming.org, which collects the top times from US athletes for each swimming event each year, Thomas posted top 100 times for her main 3 events in the men's times, notably posting back-to-back 12th and 11th place times in the 1650 freestyle, in addition to placing second in all her events in the 2019 Ivy League Championships. Additionally, Thomas did not become the number 1 ranked woman. Swimming database SwimCloud ranked her at 32 in their composite ranking on the season. Her 500-yard win, while impressive, was also an outlier in both the sense that it was her best time ever swimming for the women's team, and she was the beneficiary of a relatively weak year for the event. Her time would not have won in 6 of the 9 previous championships. Like every other athlete, she needed some luck on her side. I know this background on Thomas's swimming career is a bit excessive, but the reality of Thomas's swimming career is that she has been subject to endless scrutiny. Every minutia, from times to podium behavior, has been looked over with a fine-toothed comb in attempts to establish her as a cheater, a weird sex freak, and a man. Riley Gaines was a swimmer for the University of Kentucky. From 2018 to 2021, her time in the 200-yard freestyle went from 347th to 3rd in the nation, and nobody cared, because she is cisgender. Throughout her college career, she went from outside of the top 300 in composite ranking to 25, and nobody cared, because she is cisgender. She won 2 SEC championships and placed second at the NCAA championships, and nobody cared, because she is cisgender. These two would cross paths in the 200-yard final, tying for 5th place. Following the event, Gaines would be told that since they only had one 5th place trophy ready at the event, they were going to give the one they had to Thomas and send hers in the mail. As Gaines tells it, this, being temporarily denied what the average conservative would consider a participation trophy, was the moment she realized that nobody was there to protect female athletes, so they would have to stick up for themselves. From there on, Gaines would become the poster child for getting trans women out of women's sports. She adopted the framing of turf movements, casting herself as an intrepid defender of women's rights. Her website states, Riley Gaines is a leader defending women's single-sex spaces, advocating for equality and fairness, and standing up for women's safety, privacy, and equal opportunities. Like the TERF movement, Gaines also exhibits an obsession with drawing a distinction between supposedly biological cis women and trans women, what I like to call the cult of cis womanhood. Her website refers to her as athlete, advocate, woman. The site's logo is that one female symbol, and she has a podcast called Gaines for Girls. Meanwhile, on the website, Leah Thomas is referred to as a biological male and a man. Gaines spreads her message in a truly astounding number of avenues. Since her fifth-place tie, she's been a common sight in state legislatures, college campuses, right-wing media, even Congress, CPAC, and the White House, always popping up to serve as the specter of aggrieved white cis womanhood. Gaines has used her significant political clout to advocate for increased discrimination against trans athletes, notably launching Project Boycott, with boy in big capital letters so you know what it's saying, a movement which encourages cis female athletes to forfeit any matches against transgender opponents, rather than grant them the dignity of being considered an equal competitor. Despite seeming like exactly what someone who is mean in high school would come up with, this tactic has seen some use, such as the 6 teams which forfeited against San Jose State University's volleyball team because of their transgender player, or the instance of a middle schooler from West Virginia whose team forfeited a shot put championship in protest of a trans competitor. Gaines's self-framing as the face of women's rights in athletics has also caused politicians to invoke her example in their legislation. The Riley Gaines Act, which recently was signed into law in West Virginia, codifies sex-based gender terminology into law in the hopes of effectively segregating trans people. Riley Gaines has been able to turn a 5th-place tie into a successful career as a conservative activist. Not because she's just so good at activism, but because at every turn she has been propped up by the conservative establishment. Right-wing media is an incestuous crockpot of interchangeable personalities. Everyone is on everybody's show, and as a result, everyone gets promoted to the wider right-wing audience. Gaines has appeared on PragerU, The Matt Walsh Show, The Ben Shapiro Show, Fox News, The Mike Rowe Show, The Joe Rogan Show, and countless others countless times. The Leadership Institute, a nonprofit which aims to turn conservatives into leaders, has established a Riley Gaines Center, providing her with funding and additional resources, including a 6-figure salary. She's an ambassador for the right-wing Independent Women's Forum, and she's constantly being trotted out by Republican politicians. She's got that podcast, Gaines for Girls, in the conservative Outkick podcast network, which, side note, does just horrible numbers. Like, girl, I get more clicks than this. She has a best-selling book with a right-wing publisher. All this in just 3 years in the public eye. This is not some product of her just being an incredible activist with a unique and important narrative. She's not. She's putting a more conventionally attractive veneer on the all-too-common posturing of purporting to stand up for women's rights against trans women, while not being discriminatory against trans women, all the while blatantly discriminating against trans women. She is not famous because she should be. She is famous because the anti-trans movement made her so. Compared to Gaines, Thomas has received next to no institutional support. Shortly after her win, Thomas's hopes at further competitive swimming were dashed after World Aquatics, the federation which administers swimming regulations, introduced a set of rules which seemed specifically designed to keep her from swimming, barring all trans competitors who did not transition prior to age 12. Thomas attempted to challenge the ruling, but her case was eventually thrown out. There has been relatively little from Thomas in terms of public activism since the race. While Gaines plasters her likeness across the internet and the country, Thomas has been limited to a few television and online interviews and some speaking engagements. This is not a knock on Thomas's willingness to act for the community, to be clear. She's pursuing a law degree, and with the volume of vitriol she faces at every turn, it makes sense she would maintain a lower profile. But the differences between Thomas and Gaines speak to a greater rift on the trans debate, because it's not just Thomas. Virtually no trans people are able to achieve the same level of national platform as someone like Gaines. Because while Gaines and her right-wing contemporaries are beneficiaries of a conservative media ecosystem, which makes icons out of anybody willing to be anti-trans loudly enough, see Matt Walsh, Chloe Cole, Michael Knowles, Abigail Schreier, etc., prominent trans people are largely left to generate their own audiences. Real quick update, I recently put out an exclusive video on my Patreon. It's about the assassination of DRC Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. If you want to watch it, you can toss me a buck over on there. You don't gotta, but it's always appreciated. Anyways, back to transphobia. Part 2. Being a transphobe is really easy. One of the most obvious reasons why anti-trans activists are able to gain such outsized platforms is the right's heightened focus on and interest in creating culture war issues. There's a long precedent of conservatives manufacturing fear over a minority group and riding that to political success. From tough on crime pushes, which painted a picture of dangerous black drug dealers and super predators, to Anita Bryant's Save Our Children campaign, which cast gay people as a corrupting predatory influence on the youth. It's no coincidence that the anti-trans backlash has adopted this similar rhetoric of trans people as a predatory threat to women and children. Because this culture war politics is such a pivotal component of the right-wing playbook, there's a lot of interest among the right in supporting and perpetuating it. The anti-trans movement is buoyed by the extremely wealthy. In the 2024 election cycle, Elon Musk poured tens of millions of dollars into anti-trans political ads. J.K. Rowling recently founded a fund to bankroll anti-trans individuals and organizations. Turning Point USA, one of the largest forces in culture war politics on college campuses, was founded with millionaire donations and continues to receive tens of millions from rich ghouls every year. This is what allows so many transphobes to turn it into a full-time job. People like Riley Gaines and Chloe Cole make six-figure salaries off of spreading hate. This financial support, along with the institutional connections, allow them to spend all their time testifying in front of state legislatures and delivering lectures on college campuses. Most pro-trans activists can't be doing that. They need, actual jobs. Beyond just lack of resources, trans people also have a harder time going about things in general. Prominent trans people become ripe targets for online and in-person harassment. Scrolling through Leah Thomas's Instagram, most of the interactions are hate comments, and she is by no means an outlier in that regard. And when it's not active malice, it's utter indifference to trans perspectives. As of 2021, the majority of Americans don't even know a trans person. Bills go through state houses and pass into law without a single trans person's input. Even discussion of trans-related issues can often de-center actual trans people. The most notable instance of the trans athletes debate last year occurred when Algerian boxer Iman Khalif, a cisgender woman, was accused of being trans en route to a gold medal. While the harassment of Khalif sucked and continues to suck, with J.K. Rowling posting about how she's secretly a man, literally the day I wrote this, Khalif also received a deal of counter-backlash support that I straight up don't think she would have to the same extent if she was actually trans. Nobody's really out here hyping up trans Olympic weightlifter Laurel Hubbard like that, you know? Seemingly the only way for any trans-adjacent voices to get heard is to become a detransition or grifter, which brings us to what is, in my opinion, probably the most significant factor in the prominence of anti-trans voices in the trans debate. And that is the fact that the issue has been turned into a debate. If we were to take a hypothetical, purely objective look at the facts relating to transition, gender-affirming care access, and the like, there would be little to no case for any anti-trans argument. But an overwhelming lack of evidence in their favor has never stopped the right from fomenting a culture war debate. In her article, To Stop Losing the Culture Wars, Learn from Gay Marriage, psychologist Joan C. Williams points to the fact that issues like climate change were once far more bipartisan. The Environmental Protection Agency was even established under the Nixon administration, a fact that certain conservative outlets like PragerU will point to, stripped of context, to portray the modern right as pro-environment. Eventually, though, fossil fuel interests and other factors drove the right to, as Williams puts it, gain ground by turning the issue into a culture war and then winning it. Logically, this should not have worked. Climate change is an issue with such a clear scientific consensus and such an overwhelming body of evidence that pushing climate change denialism should have been dead on arrival. But human beings are not purely logical creatures. By pushing the works and voices of a vanishingly small number of scientists, many of whom are funded by special interests, some of whom aren't even scientists, the right was able to create the appearance of a lack of consensus where there wasn't one. It may be that 99% of climate scientists consider climate change a serious threat, and that 1% of loser quacks don't. But if you have, say, a news panel on climate change with one climate scientist and one climate skeptic, both in their snazzy little suits, you create the impression of a serious debate. This is a major factor in just barely over half of US adults viewing climate change as a major threat. Williams gives another interesting point, though, which is how the right ties their culture war issues to a working class identity. In discussions of climate change, Republicans love pointing to how many American jobs rely on the fossil fuel industry, how wind turbines kill bald eagles, a national symbol, and the supposed negative financial impact that a switch to renewables would have. This further demotivates the American people from actually doing anything about climate change, and is a large part of why nobody really seems to care about it today. Another instance of how a small subset of bad information getting outsized attention can ruin a public discourse comes to us in the case of anti-vaccine ideology. As you may well know, the anti-vax movement got its start with the publication of disgraced former doctor Andrew Wakefield's shitty retracted study on the MMR vaccine. In his video, Vaccines and Autism, A Measured Response, H. Bomber Guy details how, following this study, Wakefield and his supporters were given a genuinely baffling amount of media coverage, pointing to a 2003 study which found that viewers of media coverage of the MMR vaccine came away with the false impression that scientific consensus was split on whether the vaccine posed a safety threat, which they were not and had never been. I think these media pushes are largely driven by two things. First is the journalistic imperative to present all sides of a discussion, to an extent that often results in overprivileging certain niche, often wrong ideas. Second is the push to be the first to break the news if there's a danger. Publications were quick to talk about Wakefield's shitty retracted paper because if he wasn't a hack, and there was any validity to his claims, it could present a serious issue, and you'd get the prestige for being the first one to break the story. Transgender issues slot really well into this framework. Fearmongering about the negative impacts of hormone replacement therapy and puberty blockers butts up against overwhelming medical and pediatric support for their usage, to the point where a solid majority of Americans oppose trans kids having access to life-saving care, going to the extent that even many trans people are scared to take HRT, which is baffling. Worries about theoretical bathroom assault create a media image of predatory trans people that shunts trans people into the wrong bathrooms so they can get actually assaulted. And perhaps no trans issue meets the media moment as well as detransitioners. Detransitioners, specifically those who detransitioned because they've stopped identifying as trans and now oppose the trans community, receive such outsized media attention, you would never guess they represent a small fraction of a small fraction of a small fraction of the community. Despite an overwhelming amount of people being happy with their transitioning, or detransitioning due to social factors, this small cadre of detrans grifters creates a false impression that detransition is a very likely outcome of transition, which is then used to prevent minors from medically transitioning per the belief they will grow out of it. I feel it's irresponsible not to present just how skewed the numbers actually are here. When such an outsized amount of trans-related speakers and prominent voices are detransitioners, it gives the impression that those unhappy with their transition are a large segment of the community, rather than a fraction of a fraction. Of course, these detransitioners have the right to talk about their experiences, but that shouldn't have to come at the expense of the rights of millions of happy trans people. Part 3. A change in direction. The final reason I'd like to look at for why anti-trans voices have such an outsized presence in the US today compared to their pro-trans counterparts is a matter of political consensus. Simply put, the Republican Party is generally committed to being loudly and openly anti-trans, but the Democratic Party is not meeting their zeal with equally zealous trans support. Democratic politicians do generally vote in support of trans people, but the community is not a central part of their rhetoric. Washington Post reporter Casey Parks estimates that Republicans spent $215 million on just anti-trans advertisements in the 2024 election cycle, with the Trump campaign adopting the slogan, "Kamala is for they, them. Trump is for you." But if you were to listen to the actual Harris campaign, you wouldn't come away with the impression that Kamala was all about they, them. The work by Casey Parks found that the Harris campaign didn't take out a single pro-LGBTQ rights ad. No trans people were invited to speak at the DNC, where there had been trans speakers the prior 2 cycles. There were 50 trans and non-binary people invited as delegates in non-speaker capacities, but this is the problem. Internally, the Democrats' general support for transgender people, while admittedly nowhere near perfect, may remain largely in place, but externally, the message being sent to the public at large on trans rights is nothing. Harris wasn't trying to bring it up at all on the campaign trail if she could help it. In the wake of Trump winning the 2024 election, a swath of pundits came out with the take that the reason Harris lost was transgender people. Personally, I'd be more likely to put the single biggest factor as economics, and more specifically, the American public's baffling misunderstanding of how economics works, to the point that as long as a Republican is in office, people seem to perceive the economy as better. Like, motherfuckers, are you stupid? But to the extent that trans rights lost Harris the election, it is, like with the economic debate, primarily because she failed to present a message on trans rights that registered with voters. She largely sat out on discussion of trans issues, allowing her opponent to dominate the conversation in the same way transphobes have dominated the conversation for the past decade. In my last video on trans issues in 2023, I predicted that Republicans campaigned on trans issues so heavily in 2022, not because it would win them elections that year, but because they knew that by turning it into a pressing culture war issue, they could reap dividends on it later. The Overton window on transgender rights in America, and much of the Western world, has shifted significantly in opposition because of the extent to which they have been able to control the conversation. To the extent that trans rights has become a losing issue for the Democratic Party, It is because their refusal to take a more substantive stand has ceded ground to their opponent. Going forward, the answer is not, as so many centrist pundits are eager to suggest, scaling back on support for trans people. It is to push an adamantly pro-trans message, to elevate trans voices. I'd like to shout out Aaron Reed and Gemma Stone, two trans journalists whose work I've consulted a lot over the years in talking about transness. We cannot continue to devote countless press coverage to transphobic tirades, to have the only voice on trans rights the average person hears be a negative one. Support for transgender rights is only a losing issue when we allow it to become one. We must reclaim the narrative before it is too late. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and donate to my Patreon to get that exclusive video and your name in the credits, like my $10 patrons, Yearning to Fly, Amy Gleixner, Mona Abdel Karim, Arlen, Christopher France, Roxy, and Jessica Starling. Sorry about the long hiatus. I had a very intensive semester at school, and the video I was working on for most of 2025 fell through because I got the worst writer's block I've ever gotten. In positive news, I've graduated. I'm going to be working even harder on the channel from here on. And one final message for the trans people watching: keep on swaggin'.